Alright, what's going on everyone? In this video we're going to be building this geocoding and map application that you're seeing here on the screen. Now to build this we're going to be using Vue 3 on the front end, and we're also going to be utilizing Express on the back end to make our API call to our third-party service, so that way we don't expose our API key to the front end. Okay, now in addition to this, we're also going to be using Tailwind 3.0 for the styling, and we're going to be using leaflet and mapbox for our map here, as well as mapbox for our geocoding API to retrieve information on places that the user is searching for. Okay, now before we get into building this, let me first show you how it works here. So when we first load in, we're going to get the user's location using the geolocation API, and we're going to plot a marker here. So for this demo, you can see that I'm in Orlando, Florida. Now, if we don't want to use a location for this application, we can come to the top here where we have this location icon and we can remove it. And now the app is not going to track our location. But to make this application work a little bit better, you're going to want to use the location. Okay, so as you can see, we can zoom out and we can move over the map here. So the purpose of this is to search for places that are by you that you want to maybe go to. So for example, we want to go get a coffee, so let's go to Starbucks here. So what it's going to do is, since we have the location enabled, it's going to look for places that are called Starbucks that are near you. Okay, so for example, if I click on the second result here, it's going to plot this blue marker here, which is Starbucks, and then the red marker here is going to be our location. Okay, so pretty simple, and you can see here we get this little box that tells us about the place we chose. So it's Starbucks, the address, and the type of location this is. So Starbucks is a coffee and a cafe, and if we don't want to have this location, visible, or we don't want to have it marked anymore, we can click on the X right here, and that's going to remove it from the map. Okay, so that's what we're going to be building, so let's get started. Alright, so before we begin, there is a few things that you're going to need in order to follow along and create this project. Now, the first thing is you want to make sure you have Node installed on your system. Now, if you're unsure if you have Node installed on your system, or if you're unsure of the version you have, all you want to do is open up your terminal on Mac or command prompt on Windows, and you want to run the command of node-v, and this should return you a version if you have Node installed. If you don't get a version returned here, then you're going to want to download and install the recommended version here over on nodejs.org. Okay, now for this video, we are going to be using version 16.13.1, which at the time of recording this video is the recommended version. Now, the next thing you're going to need is the Vue CLI, which is what we're going to use to quickly scaffold out and build our new Vue project once you get around to creating the front end of this application. Now, for this video and application, we're also going to be using version 5 of the Vue CLI. So if you're unsure if you even have the Vue CLI installed on your system, or if you're unsure of the version you currently have, very similar to how we did with Node, we can open up our terminal or command prompt and we can run a command called Vue --version here, and it should output us the version if we have the Vue CLI installed on our system. Now, if you don't get any type of version returned to you, that means you do not have the Vue CLI and you need to install it. And you can install it using this command right here of npm install -g at vue/cli at next. Okay, now if you did get a return version back, but it's not currently version 5, maybe it's something like version 4 or version 3, then you're going to want to update that the same way as if you didn't have the Vue CLI installed. You want to run the same command right here. So the last thing that you're going to need is an account with Mapbox, which is what we're going to be using to display our map within our application, and we're also going to be using the geocoding API from them as well. Now, both of these features are going to require us to have an API key, and to generate an API key, we need to have a free account. So if you don't have an account with Mapbox, be sure to pause the video now and create one before continuing on with this video. Alright, so let's begin to build our application. So I'm going to be using VS Code here as my text editor for this video, and currently open within VS Code, I just have this empty folder. And what we want to start with first is going to be building our Express server, which will handle our API requests to our third-party service, which is going to be Mapbox, to get our geocoding data. Alright, so first off, what we want to do is we want to create a new folder here, and we're going to call this server. Then we're going to open up our terminal here, and we want to cd into this folder. So we'll do cd env, and we'll go into our server, which is for change directory. And within here, what we want to do is you want to create a new package.json. So to do this, we'll say npm init, and then we'll pass the y flag here to create our new package.json file. So now if we open up our server folder here, you should now see we have this package.json file. Now with this created, we can begin to install all the dependencies that we're going to need for our server here. So to do this, we're going to say npm and I for install, and we're going to install Express here. We'll do .env for our environment variables. We're going to install cores, and we also need Axios as well. All right, so if we do that, we can now see we get this node modules folder. We have our package lock.json, and if we go into our package.json now, you can see we have our 4 dependencies here. Now, in addition to our dependencies here, we also want to install a dev dependency called nodemon. Now, what nodemon does, it automatically restarts the node application each time there is a change detected to it, rather than having to do it manually yourself, which can be quite tedious. So, to install a dev dependency, what we want to do is say npm. We're still going to say I, but we want to flag it with a capital D here, okay? And then we're going to say nodemon, all right? And that's going to install nodemon here, and as you can see now, we have our dev dependency of nodemon. So while we're here inside of our package.json, let's create our scripts that we're going to execute to start our server. So we have this testing script right here. So what we want to do is replace test, and we'll say start. And then what we want to do here when we run the start command is we want to execute node on a file called index.js, which is where our server is going to reside. Now we haven't created a server yet, but the file name is going to be called index.js. All right, now we want to duplicate this down because we want to also have a dev script here because we want to start our server with nodemon instead of node. So what we can do is replace start with dev for development, and then instead of executing node on index.js, we want to say nodemon. So what we want to do next is create a few files here within our server folder. So the first one's going to be for our environment variables. So we'll create a new file here within our server, and we'll call this .env. And for our server here, we're going to have one environment variable, and we're going to call this API underscore, and we'll say key. And we don't have our API key just yet, so what I'll do for now is just set this equal to nothing. And once we have our API key, we'll come back and populate this value here. All right. Now the next file that we want to create is going to be our .getignore file to ignore certain files that we don't want to push up to our Git repository. So we'll say .getignore here. And what we want to put inside of here is we don't want to push up our environment variables. So we'll say .env, and we also don't want to push up this node modules folder as well. So we'll do node underscore modules here. Okay, and if there's anything that you didn't want to push up to your Git repository, you could just add it here inside of this file. All right, so that's all we need to do. Now, the last thing that we need is to actually create a file for our server. So we'll go into the server folder once more, and we'll create our index.js file here for the actual Express server itself. So here within this file, let's begin to create our Express server. So the first thing that we want to do is bring in Express itself. So we'll create a new variable, and we'll call this Express, and then we'll set it equal to require, and then we'll say Express here. Okay, now the next thing that we want to bring in is going to be cores. So I'll duplicate this down, and then we'll just copy both of these and replace it with cores like that. Now, the final thing that we need to bring in is going to be for our environment variables. We have a dependency called .env. Now, for this, all we want to do is just require it. So we'll say require, and then we'll do .env, and then we'll tack on .config here. Okay, now this will allow us to use our environment variables here within our server folder inside of our Express server itself. Okay, now the next thing we want to do is we want to create a variable for our port. So we'll create a new variable. So we'll say const port. And we'll set this equal to, and first off what we want to do is look for an environment variable. So we'll say process.env, and we'll say .port here. So if this exists, then this is what that variable will be set to. If it doesn't, then we want to set it to a local value here. So we'll say 3000. All right. Now the next thing we want to do is actually initialize Express. So I'll have a comment here. So we'll say init, and we'll do Express, and we'll say const app is equal to Express here. All right, there we go. Now the next thing we'll do is we want to enable cores. So we'll say enable cores like this, and to do it, we'll say app.use, and then we'll say cores like this without the 0. All right, so now we have cores enabled for our server here. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to say app.listen. And this takes in the port that we defined up here and also a callback. So we'll just say capital T here. So we'll do a comma and then we have our callback here. And all we're going to do here is just kind of specify and let us know that our server is running successfully and on what port it is running on. So we'll do console.log and I'll do some interpolation here. And let's see. So we'll have inside of here, we'll say app has started on port, and then we'll use our interpolation. So we'll have our port value in here, our port variable, and we'll do this. So now if we've done everything correctly, we should be able to open up our terminal here. And if you recall, inside of our package.json, we have this dev script here that should start our server using nodemon. So let's cd into our server folder. And then we want to say npm run dev. And if we did everything right, you can see now our app has started on port 3000. All right, so now that we have our server created and it's up and running, let's work on creating our route that we're going to be using to reach out and grab our geocoding data. So let's begin by closing out our terminal here, or just minimizing it. We don't need it right now. And we can also close out this package.json file. So where we're going to be creating this route is going to be directly here for right now inside of this index.js file. And where we're going to do it is right below where we enable cores. So I'll do a few line breaks here and we'll specify a comment here for our routes. And the route that we're going to be creating is going to be a get route. So we're going to say app.get here. And then the actual route itself, where we want to call this, is going to be /API/search here. And then it takes in a callback. So we'll have some params here for the request and also the response. So we'll say req and then res, and then we'll have our arrow function here. And just to test to make sure this is working for now, what we'll do is we'll send back some JSON. So we'll say res.json, and then we can send a success here, and we'll set this to true like this. So just to test that this route is now working, we're going to be using a program called Postman. So what we'll do is we'll go over to my other screen here. As you can see, I already had this open. So it's set to a GET request here. And then we want to enter here inside of the URL that we want to hit. So as you recall, if we go back to our server here, we're currently on port 3000. So we're going to say HTTP localhost 3000, but instead of Starbucks like an autofill here, we're going to say API/search here. So hopefully, if we set everything up right, once we hit send, we should see that JSON here of success true down here inside of the response. So let's click send here. And as you can see now, we have success, which I spelled wrong, but it's set to true. So that is all working. Now, before we can continue to work on our route, we're going to first need to grab our API key here from mapbox. So hopefully you have your account all set up. If you don't, feel free to pause it and get your account set up, then come back to the video. All right, so to create a token here, as you can see around the, just like the dashboard for Mapbox here, we can actually create a token. So if we click on this button right here, it'll take us to this create access token page. And for the name of this token, since we're going to be using it for our geocoding data, I just have it called Geocoding API, and we'll just put on here YT for YouTube. Okay, and then we're not going to touch anything here. We're just going to come down to the bottom and we're going to click on create token here. So once this loads in, it should, I guess, ask you to confirm your password. We'll just submit this like that. And then it should redirect you to this access token page. And as you can see right here, we now have this token. So what we want to do is we're going to copy this, and then we're going to come over here to our project, and inside of our env file, we just simply want to copy it in here for the value of this API key inside of our environment variables. Okay, now to ensure this actually takes, what we also want to do is, because although nodemon does restart our server anytime changes are made, I don't believe it works for environment variables. So what you need to do is also just start and stop the server as well. So we'll start it and then we'll rerun it like that. Okay, so here in the documentation for Mapbox's geocoding API, we're going to be utilizing what they call forward geocoding for this application, which just takes in a search term, as you can see right here. So in this example, they're looking for a place called Los Angeles, and then it returns the results based on that search term. Now, this API also has something called reverse geocoding, which we're not going to get into within this video, but this takes in a longitude and a latitude. All right, so scrolling back up here to these examples, it's actually quite easy to make this request. So All we need to do is pass in this endpoint right here, and then on the end of it, we just need to pass our search term. As you can see right here for this example, it's going to be Los Angeles. And the other thing that we need to add to our request is going to be this query string for the access token, which is what we just added to our environment variable file a few moments ago. Okay, so if we scroll up here, we can also add some other query strings to this request that we're going to be utilizing within this video. So we will be using the proximity. We also will be using limit, and I believe there's also one called fuzzy match right here, which what it does, I think it kind of checks for misspellings. If you spell something a little bit off, it'll still look for something like, in this example right here, they spelled Washington wrong, but it still kind of returns Washington, D.C. or something like that. So we'll kind of play around with some of these as well within our request. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But for now, let's head back over to our application and implement this API call into our route. Alright, so back here inside of our server, let's begin to build our route. So the first thing is we could remove this res.json that we added for testing. We won't need this any longer. Now, the next thing we're going to do is wrap our entire route in a try-catch block. In the event that we have any errors, we can properly handle them. So we'll pass an error param here, and then we'll just send the error back to them. So what we'll do is we'll say res.status, and we'll set this to 500 for an error. And then we'll send back the actual error, and we'll say .json here, and then we'll do error, and we'll say error.message like that. All right, so now we're going to be properly handling errors. So the next thing we want to do is if we actually head back over to the documentation, as you can see on this API call that we're going to be making to mapbox, we need to include a search term with our request. So what we want to be able to do is have the user specify that search term within the actual call. So what we need to do is on this route itself of API /search, we want to accept a parameter that they can pass with their search term. So to do this, what we'll do is on the end of this route, we'll do a slash and we'll do a colon, and we can specify the param name that we want to accept here. So we're going to be calling this query. All right, so now inside of our route, we can capture this query that the user is going to be sending along. So we'll say const, we'll create a new variable and call this query, and we'll set it equal to the request, and we can look in the params property, and then we can look for the name of the param that we define here. So we're going to say query. All right, and then just to show you that this is working, we can just simply log this out to the console here. So we'll say console.log query like that. Okay, so now if we head back over to Postman here, if we add a search term on the end of this call here, so let's just say testing query like this, and we send it, you can see we're not going to get anything back here, and it's going to keep sending. But if we head back over to the server here and we open up the console, you can now see that we're going to be capturing the user's query right here. As you can see, we have the parameter that we sent here inside of our console. So now that we have that, we have everything we need to make our request to the Geocoding API. So what we can do first off here is just minimize our terminal, and we can remove this console.log of our query here as we no longer have a need for it. Okay, now before we can actually make our request, we need to do a few things. So to make the actual request, we're going to be using Axios, which we installed here, as you can see inside of our dependencies here. We want to require that here within our server. So what we'll do is we'll just copy this down here from cores, and we'll copy both of these and just call this Axios and then require Axios here. Okay, now since we're going to be making a request with Axios to the Geocoding API, we want to make this callback here asynchronous because we need to wait for the data before returning it. So we'll just specify async here in front of our callback. All right, so now we're ready to make our actual request. So let's head back over to the documentation, and what we want to do is we're going to grab this first portion of the actual call here. So we'll copy that, and then what we'll do is we'll create a variable to actually make our request in. So we'll say const results is going to equal, and we want to await Axios, and then we're going to use some backticks here because we are going to be using some interpolation. So I'll copy the first portion in here. So what we want to do after the slash is actually add the query that the user has sent along when making this request. Okay, so we'll use money signs and these brackets, and we'll just say query. Okay, so there we go. And we also want to tack on here .json like that. So the last thing we need to do for now is actually add our access token on to make this request. So let's head back over to the documentation and we'll just copy this query string here for access token, and then we'll paste it in here to our request. So once again, we'll use some interpolation. Now, to actually get our API key here from our environment variables into this call, we want to call process.env, and we're going to say .api underscore key, because that's a name that we gave it in the environment variables here. As you can see, API underscore key. All right, so if we save this, and then what we can do for now to make sure everything is working is let's just console out the results here. So we'll say results like this. And because I've already used this, I know that what we're going to get back from this logging out this is not going to be very useful to see that it's working. So we'll just say results.data here. All right, so now if we open up our terminal here and we head back over to Postman, we can actually make a request, hopefully, if we did everything correctly. So I'm going to keep using Starbucks because I like coffee, so we'll say Starbucks like that. We'll hit send. Now we shouldn't see anything happen here because we aren't returning anything yet. We're just simply logging things out to the console. So if we head back over to our server now, you can see if I even extend this a little bit, we now are getting all this data back that matches our search term of Starbucks from the Geocoding API. So now that we know everything's working properly, we just don't want to log out to the console the data that we're receiving from our Geocoding API. We want to send that data back to the client. So let's minimize our terminal here, and the first thing we can do is remove this console.log statement, as we won't need this any longer. And what I'm going to do is create a new variable to store our data in that we're getting back here from our Axios call here. So we'll say const data equals results.data like this. Okay, so now what we want to do with our data is you want to send it back. So we'll say res, and we'll set a status here, and we'll do a 200 for successful, and then we'll send back as JSON our data here. All right, so now if we head back over to Postman and make our call, we should see the data returned as JSON. So let's go ahead and go over to Postman. And let's make this request. And as you can see here, we get all the data back from the Geocoding API. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we are going to be adding what they call optional parameters to our request. So that way we can add things like fuzzy match. We could also provide a limit to how many requests we want. And we can also do something with the proximity so that we only get results that are nearest your latitude and longitude. All right, and honestly, with the way that we're going to set it up, you can mess with any of these optional parameters that you want to use. Okay, but the problem we have right now with our route is that if we go over to Postman and we try to, for example, add one of these parameters, so say for example, we only want 2 requests for some reason. So if we pass in limit equals 2 and we send this, you can see that the result stays the same and we only don't get 2 results, we get the default, I think, of like 5 or 10. Okay, so obviously this is not working. Now the issue with why this isn't working is because we're not looking for those parameters here on the request that we're calling. The only thing that we're looking for is the query that we're adding to the route when we make the call, and also our access token here. Okay, so what we need to do is allow for our route to look for these query parameters. So what we're going to do first is, before we begin that, we need to actually import something here called the URL module, which is part of Node. So we don't actually have to install anything. We can just require it here within our server. So I'll call this const URL, and we'll set it equal to require, and we'll say URL like this. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is I'll add a comment here just to kind of show you what's going on and kind of break up our code. So we'll say add API key and query strings. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing. So what I'm going to do is create a new variable, and we're going to call this params. All right, and we're going to set this equal to what they call a new URL search params. And this will allow us to tack on all the params based on this value right here of params. Okay, so inside of here, what we're going to do is, first off, the access token is going to be something that's always on the actual param. So you want to pretty much what they call hard code this in here. That's never going to change. That's always going to be a part of the call we make here. So what we'll do is we'll say access underscore token, is going to be set equal to process.env, and we're going to say .api_key, just as we have it here like this. So what I'm also going to do is remove it from here. Okay, and you'll see why in a moment. Now, we currently aren't looking for any other query strings on our URL. The only thing we're looking for is this parameter. So that's why we imported this URL module, because we can go ahead and get any query string that the user passes and then apply it to this call right here. So how we're going to do that is we'll pass a comma here, and we're going to use the spread operator here, and we're going to say URL, and we'll say parse, and we're going to say the request and say URL, and then we'll set this to true. And then what we want to do is get all the queries. So we'll say query like this. All right. So now what we want to do is we want to tack on this variable here, params, as a query string here on the actual call. So it's going to look something like this. So we'll do our money sign, and we'll do params like this. Okay. So just to kind of show you how this works, what I'll also do is I'll log out to the console this params variable here. So we'll say like this and params. So now, for example, if we go over and make a new request, we should actually be able to limit this to 2. So if I send this, you can see now that I believe if I collapse this, we should only have 2 results. And if we go over to our console here, you can see that if we scroll down, you can see that the URL search params was canceled out, and we have limit here, which was set to 2. All right, so at this point, our route is completed and it's ready to go. But there's still one thing I do want to show you, which is how we can integrate the Express router with this route right here. Now, for this application and the server, it's probably not required since this route is so small and we only have one route, but I do want to show you how you can integrate the Express router here with your server. All right, so what we want to do first is we want to create a new folder here inside of our server. So we'll call this routes, and we want to create a individual file here for this route within the routes folder. So we'll create a new file, and you obviously want to call this something that's going to kind of indicate what this route is doing. So I'll call this search results.js here. All right. So inside of this route, we want to bring in express. So we'll say const express equals, and we'll say require, and we'll do express like this. And we also want to bring in the express routers. So what we'll do is we'll say const router is going to be equal to express and .R router like this. All right. Now, what we also want to do before I forget is we need to do a module.exports here and set this equal to the router. All right. So what we want to do inside of here is we want to go copy our route here into this file. So let's get this try and catch block right here. So we'll copy all the logic in here, and we'll just remove it from this route like that. And what we want to do is paste it inside of here. So what we'll do, instead of saying app.get, we're going to say router.get here. And the only thing that we want to require for the actual route here is going to be the actual parameter that we added. So we're going to say / query like this. And then what we want to do is we want to have our asynchronous function here for our callback. So we'll do async, and we have, let's see, request and response like this. And then all we want to do is paste in our logic here. Okay, so a few things that we need to also bring in since we're using in here is going to be what we have here. If we go back up, we want to grab Axios and our URL module. So I'll copy and remove these from our index.js as we're not going to need it here anymore. And then we'll paste it right below here. All right, so that should actually do it for our search results file. So now what we want to do is fix some things up here inside of the main index.js file. So instead of saying app.get here, we're going to say app.use, and we're still going to look for the route API/search. All right. Now, instead of calling a asynchronous function when that route is hit, we just want to require the actual file that we want to hit when we hit this endpoint here. And actually, we don't want to do the / there. So we're going to require, and we want to navigate to our routes folder, and we want to hit the search results.js file. So we'll say search results .js like that. All right, so hopefully if we didn't mess anything up, we should still be able to go over to Postman and make this request, but now we have our code here in a separate file, which, like I said, it doesn't really make things or make too much of a difference with our application here, but if you're getting into bigger projects, you can now see how much more cleaner your main index.js file is with doing this method here. Okay, so let's test this out to make sure we didn't break anything. So we'll go back to Postman and we'll make a call here, and as you can see, we still get back the same result. Alright, so now that we have the back end of our application complete, let's work on the front end. So what we want to do first is open up a new terminal here, and we want to make sure we're at the root level of our folder. Alright, so we're going to be using Vue for the front end of this application, and to create a new Vue project, we're going to be using the Vue CLI. So if you didn't install it earlier, be sure to pause the video now and install it prior to continuing. Okay, so how we can create a new Vue project is we can specify the keyword Vue. We're going to say create, and then we want to give this new Vue project a name. So we're going to call this clients. Okay, and if I can spell this right. Okay, so once we do that, it should prompt us with a few options here. So as you can see, there's a Vue 3 standard, default, and another default, but we're going to go down to the bottom here, and we're going to manually select our features. Okay, so we have a few options that are pre-chosen for us, and the only thing I do want to check off here is going to be the router. We're not going to be needing a CSS preprocessor because we're going to be using Tailwind for the styling of our application here. So once we've selected a router, we can hit enter here. It's going to ask us what version we want, which we're going to be using 3, and then it says use history mode for router. We're going to say yes here. Okay, and then the next option here is going to be for the linter/formatter, which I'm just going to use the selected version here, or the top version, and then it's going to ask us if the additional lint features. We'll just say lint on save, and then we can select here the default option again for the placing of our config inside of the dedicated config files. Okay, and then it'll also ask you to pre-save this, and we're just going to say no, and that should start to create our new Vue project. Okay, so once that has completed, we should now see we have this client folder here inside of our project, and if we expand it, we can see all these files here, which is our new Vue project. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we want to cd into this client folder here, and we want to spin up what they call a local development server, so that as we're making changes within our project here, we can see them live within the browser. So first off, let's do a change directory here into our client folder, because right now we're in the root, so we'll say client. And then if we go to our package.json here, you can see that when you use the Vue CLI, it generates some scripts here for us, and one of those is called serve, which this is going to build our local development server. So what we can do is say npm, and we're going to say run, and we'll do serve. All right, and that's going to spit up a local development server here for us. Now, depending if you have other things running, for me, I have a few other projects that are currently up on my local host. The default port, I believe, is 8080, but it'll increment if you have other things on 8080. So the next one will be 8081. And as you can see here, for me right now, it's localhost port 8082. So if we command and click this, you can see that this is the general structure of the Vue project that you get when using the Vue CLI. But obviously we don't want all this stuff, so we need to do some cleanup here. So generally, whenever you create a new project from the Vue CLI, this is something you're always going to want to do. So let's first navigate into our SRC folder here, and let's start off with our views. So as you can see, we have this about view, and we also have this home view. So for this project, we don't have any need for this about view, so I'm going to delete it like this. All right, but now if we head back over to our browser, you can see that we have this error that it can't resolve the view we just deleted because it's actually referenced within our router. So what we want to do is open up our router folder here, go into our index.js file, and as you can see right here, they have this route created for that file that we just removed. So we want to remove this as well, and that should resolve our error here. Okay, now the next thing you want to do is if we go into our components folder, we have this hello world component, and I'll just close out this. So once again, we don't have any need for this within our project, so I'm going to delete it like this. All right, and now the same issue is going to happen if we go back over here. We get another error because once again, this component was actually imported within our home view here, as you can see. So let's remove all instances of this hello world component from our home view here as well. So we'll remove this. We'll remove the import here and also the reference here inside of our components. Okay, so if we take a look now, we're left with something like this. So we can also, while we're here in our home view, we can remove this image. We don't have any need for this as well. And that should remove it from the actual view here. Okay, now the last thing you want to do is we have this other file called app.view, and as you can see we had this navigation for going back and forth between the home and the about view. So we don't want to have this anymore, so I'll remove this. And since we're also going to be using Tailwind, we don't have any need for these style tags here, so I'm going to remove this as well. And if we save that, we should now have a nice clean slate to begin our project. Okay, so what we're going to do next is install all of the dependencies that we need for the front end portion of our application, and the biggest one's going to be Tailwind CSS here. So what I have on the screen is the documentation for integrating Tailwind CSS into a Vue 3 project. All right, so obviously we already have our project created, so we can bypass this first step here, and the second step is going to be actually installing Tailwind CSS here. So what I'll do is I'll copy this command right here, and we'll head back over to our project. So I also have opened up a new terminal, so what we want to do is cd back into our client folder here. So we'll do client here, and then we'll paste in this command. So what we're going to be installing is Tailwind CSS, Post CSS, and also Auto Prefixer. So let's go ahead and enter here and install those. And there we go. So if we head back over to the documentation, now the next thing is we want to run this command right here of npx tailwind css init with the p flag on it to install or create the tailwind.config.js file and also the postcss.config.js file. So let's also copy and paste this into the terminal here. So we'll come here, we'll paste this in, and once we see this, we have an indication that it created both of these. If we scroll down here, we now see we have our post.css file and also the Tailwind config file here. All right, now this isn't part of Tailwind, but I also want to install a few other dependencies while we still have our terminal open here. So we're going to say npm I, and we want to install Axios, and also we want to install leaflet, which is what we're going to be using for our map for the application. So we'll say leaflet like this. All right, and then once those are installed, we can close our terminal here. So if we head back over, oops, that's Postman. If we head back over to the documentation here, we can see the next thing we want to do is we need to add the paths to all of our template files in the Tailwind config file here. So what I'll do is I'll copy this snippet right here that we need to change, and we'll head back over to our project, and we'll open up our Tailwind config file here. And we'll just copy or highlight the content here and replace it with what they had in the documentation. Okay, now what I'm also going to do is I want to enable the just-in-time mode here. So we're going to say JIT, and we'll set this equal to true. Okay, and that's all we're going to need to do here inside of our Tailwind config. So I'll close that out. So if we head back over to the documentation, the next thing we want to do is add the Tailwind directives to your CSS. So we need to create a Tailwind CSS file within our project, and then we want to use all these directives here inside of that file. So we'll copy this and we'll head back over, and where I'm going to create this is actually in our assets folder here. So we'll do a new file and we'll say tailwind.css here, and we'll just copy and paste all these in. All right, so the next thing you want to do is actually import the CSS file into our main.js. So let's go back over to our project here and open up the main.js. And then what we're going to say here is we'll do import, and we're going to say /src and then assets, and then we want to import the tailwind.css file here. All right, and that's all we need to do. So now we should be all set to use Tailwind within our project here. So what I'll also do to make sure everything's working properly is go back over to the client here, and then I'll restart our server to make sure everything is working properly. So now once this restarts, if we go to, for example, the, let's wait for this to finish here. All right, there we go. So if we head over to our home view now, and for example, we want to, let's say, have an H1 tag here, and let's do this, and we'll say testing Tailwind here. So if we save this and we go over to the browser here in our client, we can see we have this H1. But let's see to make sure that our Tailwind is actually installed correctly if we can apply a few Tailwind classes here. So what we'll do is we'll say class, and we'll do a text class of extra large here. And then let's also add a color. So we'll say text red, and we'll do 500 here. So hopefully if we install Tailwind correctly, we should be able to see these two classes on the header tag here, which we do. So we have now installed Tailwind into our project successfully. Alright, so with that, we're now ready to begin building the front end of our application, and we're going to start with implementing our map via Leaflet. So what I have here on the screen is a little quick start guide for implementing Leaflet into our application. So if we scroll down here, we have to do a few preparations before we can actually begin to set up and display our map here. So the first thing we want to do is include this leaflet CSS file into the head section of our document or application. So I'm going to copy this. We'll head back over to our project here, and where we want to include or paste this in is within the public folder here. We have this index.html file. So we'll come in here, and within the head section of this file, we want to include that CSS file. So there we go. Now, the next step calls for us to include this JavaScript script tag right here after the CSS file. But since we installed Leaflet via npm, we're going to skip this step, and we're going to do this a little bit differently. So we don't need to worry about this for our application. Now, the next thing here is we need to create an element with where we want our map to be displayed. So you can see in this example, they just gave it an ID of map, which is fitting because this is actually a map. So what we'll do is just copy this HTML, and we can close out this index.html file, and where we want to display our map is going to be within this home view here. So we'll just do a line break here and paste this HTML in here inside of the div of the class of home. Okay. So the last thing we need to do before we can actually begin to set up our map is give our map some height here. So as you can see, they're just targeting this with standard CSS, and they are referring to the ID of map here, which obviously connects to this. But since we're going to be using Tailwind, we're going to be addressing or doing this in a little bit of a different way. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we want to do is on this div with the class of home, I'm actually going to remove this class of home. It doesn't have any value since we're using Tailwind, and I want to give this wrapper div, we're going to call it, a height of 100 VH. Now to do this within Tailwind, we're going to say h-screen here, and I also want to give this a position of relative. All right, and I think I spelled that wrong again. Let me see. Yeah, I did. All right, there we go. So now that we have this, we want to apply a few classes here on the actual map itself. So since this is going to be 100 VH, you want the map to take up the full amount of the space. So what we'll say is h full like that for 100%. And I want to give this map a z index value. So when using Tailwind, they have, I think, specific classes for z index. So I think it's like z0 for a z index of 0. Then I also think they have a z-index class of like z10 for a z-index value of 10, but since we have enabled what they call the just-in-time mode, which I did do a video on, so if you want to go a little bit more in depth with all the features of the just-in-time mode, I'll leave a link to that video down below in the description or in a card above. But as you can see here, we did enable this, so what we have access to is what they call arbitrary values, which can make it so we don't have to always use the standard classes that Tailwind provides. So for example, Tailwind doesn't have a class for a z-index with a value of just 1 for a z-index of 1, but we can actually achieve this with the just-in-time mode and arbitrary values here. So we can surround the value that we want in these brackets here and just provide, we want to do a z-index value of 1 here. All right, so we're going to be using this method a few times within our application here for the styling. All right, so I just wanted to go ahead and explain that. So I believe that's all the preparations we have to do. So now we can actually begin to set up and display our map here. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is initialize our map. And as you can see within the documentation, they provide us this little snippet of code here that shows us how we can do this. Now, since we are going to be using Vue, we will handle this initialization a little bit differently. So how this works is they're calling this map function right here, and they're passing in the value of map itself. So where this value of map is coming from is actually the ID that they gave the element right here. So for example, if you gave this an ID of, let's say, new map, then you'd want to pass in new map here inside of this function. And then they're also calling the set view function here, which is going to set the center of the map with these two coordinates, and then also a zoom level of 13. So what I'm going to do is copy everything up until this period here. Okay. And then let's head over to our project. So first off, we want to import the leaflet library into this component or view. So we'll say import, and we'll say leaflet from, and we'll do leaflet here. Let's see, why is it not auto-populating for me? Let's try this again, and we'll say leaflet here. All right, now we are going to be using the composition API, so we will be using the setup function for our application here. So we don't have access to any of our markup here until the application has been mounted to the DOM. So we're going to want to use the onMounted lifecycle hook. Now, when using the composition API, to use that, you need to import it first. So let's also do that. So we'll say import, and we'll say onMounted here, and we'll say from view. All right, so let's create our setup function here. And the first thing I'm going to do is create a new variable, and we'll call this map here. And then the rest of the logic is going to be actually handled in our onMounted lifecycle hook. So I'll copy this to keep it simple, and then we'll create our onMounted lifecycle hook here. So we'll just create our arrow function here. So what we want to do is we want to have a comment here to init map here. All right, and then all we're going to do is we're going to say map equals, and we refer to the leaflet library here with leaflet because that's the name we gave it. So for example, in the documentation, they refer to it as L. So if we were to give this a value of just like L, we could do the same thing, but I feel this is more explicit and it lets us know that we're referring to leaflet here. So we'll say leaflet, and then we'll paste in, well, I got to go back because I copied onMounted here. So let's recopy this code here. And we'll copy the period actually too. So we'll say leaflet, and then .map, and then we have the actual ID of the map here, and then we're set in the view. Now what I want to do is actually change the value here inside of the set view function to something different. So I'm just going to copy and paste in some stuff here. So we're going to say 28, and then all the decimals beyond here, and then say -81, and then we're going to do a zoom level of 10. All right, so that is the first portion here. Now, the next thing we need to do is add what they call a tile layer to our map, and we're going to do this via mapbox. So if you take a look at the snippet of code that we need to add to our project, you can see that there's a few spots where we need to add an access token from mapbox. We need to add it here, and we also need to add it here. All right, so if you recall earlier for our server, we did go over to Mapbox and we generated this new API key right here. So technically we could use the same one, but I want to keep them separate. All right, so what we'll do is we're going to create a new token here, and we're just going to call this map, and we'll say YouTube here. All right, so, and then we'll just hit create token here. We don't need to do anything else, and I believe it should require us to submit a password here as well. Okay, so there we go. Now what I want to do is I want to create an env file here within the front end to hold this API key. So let's copy this, and then let's go over to our front end here, and where I want to create this is in the actual client folder. So we're going to do a new file. We'll say .env, and then the actual name of the variable here, we're going to call this, we'll say view, we'll do app underscore, oops, that's a plus, underscore again, API underscore key here. Okay, and then we'll set this equal to our API key that we just generated. All right, so there we go. So now that we have this, let's copy the snippet of code and add it to our project here. So I'll copy this, and we'll go back to VS Code here, and where we want to add it is inside of our onMounted lifecycle hook here. So we'll do a few line breaks here, and we'll say add tile layer here, spell that right, And then what we're going to do is we'll say leaflet, and then we'll paste this in like that. All right, so obviously what we also need to do is add our access token, otherwise this isn't going to work. So let's come over here, and what we want to do is, because we are going to be using our env variable, we want to do some interpolation here. So we'll change out these quotes for backticks like this here, and then what we want to do is we'll keep the brackets here, we'll add a money sign, and we'll say process dot env, and we'll say view underscore app underscore API underscore key here. Okay, so once again, I'll just copy this because we do need to add it here as the access token as well as in this URL. So what we'll do is we'll remove this and we'll paste it in there like that. All right, so if we've done everything correctly, we should now be able to go over to the browser and see we have a functioning map. Okay, so here inside of the browser, as you can see, our map is not being populated. So if we go to inspect it here, you're going to see we have in the console a 401 error. And if I refresh it here, you can see the issue is that our access token is currently undefined, even though we have set it to our env variable inside of our project here. Now, the reason why this is undefined is because when we added this env file, we never did a restart to our client here. So what we need to do is we need to stop the server and we need to rerun it. All right, and that should look for this new env file, and we should then be able to go back over to our browser and see a fully working map. So it has restarted. If we go back over here, you can now see we have our map being displayed. Okay, so now that we have that, the next thing we want to do is obtain the user's location using the geolocation API. So let's collapse this on-mounted lifecycle here to save some space, and let's do a few line breaks. All right. So the first thing we want to do is create a few pieces of data that we're going to be using throughout our functions. Now, before we create any data, we want to ensure that that data we create is what they call reactive. And to create reactive data using the setup function and the composition API, we want to import something from Vue that is called a ref. All right, and when we create our data using a ref, it allows it to be reactive here inside of our setup function. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So the first piece of data we're going to create is for storing the user's coordinates. So we'll call this coords, and we'll set this equal to a ref with the initial value of null. Now, the next piece of data we're going to create is called fetch, and we'll do coords. And I'm pretty sure you can assume what this is for. So when we use the geolocation API, we always don't instantly get back the results of the user's location. So we're going to use this value right here to display a little loading animation between the time we start fetching the coords and by the time we finish and we have the coords. Okay, and then the last piece of data we're going to create here is for storing our marker that we're going to plot with the coordinates on our leaflet map. So we'll call this geo marker, and we'll set this to a ref with the initial value of null as well. All right, so let's create our first function here, and we're going to call this get geolocation, and we're going to set it equal to a arrow function here. Now, the first thing that we want to do is we want to update this data value here of fetch coords to true because we're going to begin fetching our coordinates here. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll say fetch coords dot value, because to update a value that is a ref here inside of our setup function, we need to do it like this. We just can't say fetch coords equals true. That's not going to work. So we'll tack on dot value here. All right, now the next thing is we want to begin reaching out to our geolocation API to get the user's coordinates. So to do this, we'll say navigator and then do .geolocation, and we're going to use a method called getCurrentPosition. Now this accepts two parameters and a third optional one for specific options, which we're not going to do here within this application. So the first one is if it's successful, and then the second parameter if there's an error. So we're going to have two callback functions. So the first callback function, if it's successful, is going to be called setCoords, and then if there's an error, we're going to say get lock, and we'll do error like this. So it's specific and we know what's going on here. All right, and that's going to be our function for now. We will make some updates to this later, but to keep it simple and get the basics down, we're going to just keep it like this. Okay, so let's create our two functions here. So let's do const, and we'll say set coords, and we'll set this equal to another arrow function here. Now for this, when it is successful, we will have the position. So you want to pass this as a parameter here. And then just for now, we'll log out to the console the actual result here just to see what's kind of going on. So we'll say console.log, and then we'll do POS like that. All right. And then let's do our get location error as well. So there we go. This equal to an arrow function like this, and this will also return us something as well, which will be the error. So what we can do here as well is just console or log out to the console that specific error. All right, so to initiate our function here, what we want to do is we'll do this once the application has been mounted. So we'll come here into our mounted lifecycle hook, and we'll just initiate this function. So if we save this and head over to our browser, we should now see logged out the current position of my location. Okay, so here inside of the browser, you can see we're now logging out to the console this geolocation position object. So if I expand this here, you can see we have this chords object, and we also have this timestamp. And if we expand this chords object here, you can now see we have the user's latitude and we have the user's longitude. Okay, so really quickly here, if you're getting this message inside of your console that reads user has denied geolocation, I want to show you how we can resolve that here on Mac. Now, if you're on Windows, you may have to do a little bit of Google searching in order to figure this out, but I'm sure it's pretty simple as well. So what's happening is this function right here that we created called getLockError is being returned. So we're logging out to the console the error, which you can see right here. Now, if you're on MacBook, what's probably happening is you don't have your location services enabled within your system preferences and then inside of security and privacy. So what we want to do is enable it for that specific browser. So what I'm going to do is click the unlock button here. I'm going to authenticate, and then all we want to do is enable location services for the browser that you're using. And in my case, it's going to be Google Chrome. So if I enable this and we come back to our browser here and we do a quick refresh, you can see now we are getting the current location here. Okay, so for this function we've created here called setChords, we want to do more than just log out to the console the current location of our user. Now, I mainly did this for testing purposes, so let's begin by removing this console.log statement here. All right, now when this function is ran, that means we have successfully obtained our user's location. So the first thing that we want to do is stop fetching chords here. And what I mean by that is we have this value right here to indicating whether or not we're fetching our chords, and we set that to true here. So since we have them when this function is ran, we can begin by setting this back to null. Now, the next thing that we're going to do, which is optional, is take the user's coordinates that we receive back from the geolocation API, and we're going to store them inside of our session storage. So that way, if a user refreshes the page, we don't always have to reach back out to the geolocation API to retrieve the user's coordinates if we already done it once. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So we'll do a few line breaks here and add a comment, and we'll say set chords in session storage. All right. So how we'll do this is we're going to create a new variable here, and we'll call this set session, and we'll do chords, and then we'll set this equal to an object here. So we want to have our latitude, so we'll call this lat, and we're going to reference our parameter here of POS for position, and then we'll say chords, because remember we have that object of chords, and then on that chords object we had the latitude. Okay, and then also we want the longitude, so I'll say LNG, and we'll do the same thing, so POS, and then the chords object, and then we'll do longitude here. All right, there we go. So now that we have this variable, what we want to do is then set this variable to the session storage. So how we do that is we'll say session storage here, and we'll say set item, and then this is a method and it takes a name, so we're going to call this chords, and then we want to say JSON here dot stringify, and then we want to pass in our variable here of set session chords like that. All right, and that's all we need to do. Now, the next thing we want to do is update our value here of chords that we created here in the beginning. So we want to update these to the value that we have received from the geolocation API. So I'll have another comment here. So we'll say set ref chords value, and then we're going to say chords dot value is going to equal the actual coordinates here. So we can just take this and then we can do that. All right, so there we go. Now, the last thing that we want to do is we then want to plot the user's location on our leaflet map. And to do that, we're actually going to create another function to handle this, and we're going to call this plot geolocation, and then we'll pass in the chords variable here. Alright, so before we create this function here, I did want to mention that we will be using a custom icon for the marker that we'll be plotting on our map. And if you want to use the same marker that I am throughout this video, you can find those on the finished repository under the assets folder here. You can see we have this map marker blue and we have this map marker red. So you can also find a link to the repository down below in the description. All right, so one thing before we create our function too is I forgot that we just don't want to pass in chords here. We need to say chords.value. All right, so let's create our function here. So we'll call this obviously plot geolocation, and we'll set this equal to an arrow function here. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to create our custom marker, and we're going to store that inside of a variable. So we'll add a comment here and we'll say create custom marker. So let's create a variable for our marker, and we'll call this custom marker, and then we'll set it equal to leaflet. And leaflet has a method called icon that accepts an object with a few different properties for defining your custom marker. And the first one's for the icon itself that you want to use, and this is held in a property called icon URL. And then what we want to do is require here, and then we want to navigate into our assets folder. And for our geolocation marker, we're going to be using this map marker red SVG. So I'll just copy and paste this in here like this. Now, the next property that we want to define on this object is going to be the icon size. So we'll say icon and do size here, which is supposed to be camel case. And this takes an array with the width and height. So what we'll do is this one will be 35 pixels wide and then 35 pixels tall. All right, and there's our custom marker. Now, the next thing we want to do is actually create our marker and apply our custom marker here. All right, so before I forget, we also want to pass in chords here as a parameter. So what we'll do here is add a new comment, and we'll say create new marker with chords and custom icon. All right, so we're also going to hold this new marker inside of our value up here that we created, or our data value of geomarker. So what we'll do here is we'll say geomarker dot value is going to be set equal to leaflet, and to create a new marker, we use the marker method on leaflet here. Okay, and this accepts an array first off with the actual coordinates that we want to plot this marker at. So what we'll do is we'll reference our chords parameter here, and then on that what we did is we created this up here. We have this lat value and we have this lang value for longitude. So what we want to do is first specify the latitude. So we'll say chords.lat and do a comma for chords.longitude. Okay, and then to actually use our custom marker here, we want to pass a comma here, and then we'll have a new object and we'll say icon, and then we'll pass our custom marker here. All right, so there we go. Now, the next thing we want to do is to actually add this to our map. So what we want to attach here at the very end is we'll say add, and then to, and then we'll say map, because if you recall, if we go back up to the very top here of our script tag, we created this new variable here of map, and this is what we actually initialize here in the beginning when we set up our map. Okay, so pretty much what we're doing here is we're creating a new marker, and then we're adding it to our map. All right, so there we go. Now, the next thing we want to do is, because if you go back all the way up to the top here, you can see that we manually set the view to the coordinates of my current location because I knew that. So in the event that you're probably not where I'm at, you want the map to be centered to your location. So what we'll do is then we'll recenter the map here. So I'll do a few line breaks and we'll create a new comment here for setting map view to current location. So what we want to do is we first want to reference our map variable here, and we want to call the setView method. Now, the setView method takes in as an array the latitude and the longitude, very similar to how we've done it here inside of our marker method. So what I'll do is just copy and paste this in here like that. And then it also takes in the zoom level, which we'll set to 10. All right, and there we go. That should then set the map view to the current user's location. So now if we head over to our browser, we should see plotted on our map a marker with our current location. Okay, so as you can see now inside of our application, we have a marker plotted on the map with our current location. Alright, so back here inside of our project, we need to make an update to this function we have here called getGeolocation. So what's going on is when this geolocation API call is successful, we are running this function called setCoords. Now inside of here, we're taking the chords and we're then setting them to a new item inside of our session storage. So what we want to do inside of this function, or the change we need to make, is we want to check to see if that item exists inside of our session storage. If it does, then we want to grab that value. If it doesn't, then we want to reach out to the geolocation API, because at that point we wouldn't have the chords. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. So what I'll do here is add a comment, and we'll say check session storage for chords, and then we'll have our if condition here, and to check if it exists, we'll just say session storage dot get item, and then we're going to look for the item we created, which is going to be chords. Okay, so if this is true, that means we have this item stored inside of our session storage. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our data value up here that we created, and we're going to set it equal to the item inside of our session storage. So we'll say chords dot value is going to equal, and we'll say JSON dot parse, and then we're going to say session storage dot get item, and we'll say chords here. All right, so there we go. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to then run this function right here for plotting the marker on the map. So what I'll do is just copy this here, and then we'll paste it right below. All right, and since we don't want the remainder of this function to run if this is true, we can just return out of here. Okay, so essentially what's going to happen is when this function is ran, it's first going to check to see if this is true. If it is, we're going to reach out to session storage and grab that value, and then we're going to plot that marker on the map, and then we're going to return out of the function. Now, if it doesn't return true, then we're going to reach out to the geolocation API and obtain the user's location. Okay, so as of right now, whenever we have an error from our geolocation API, we're just logging it out to the console here, which isn't a very good way to handle an error. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the error that we receive and we're going to output it inside of a modal, so that way the user knows we're having an issue getting their location. All right, so let's first start off with the functionality here. So let's remove this console.log statement, and the first thing that we want to do is, because inside of this function where we are potentially going to initiate the call to our geolocation API, we have set this fetch chords value to true. So if we have an error, we want to set this to null. So we'll say fetch chords.value, and we'll set this to null like that. All right, now the next thing we need to do is create a few new pieces of data here. So the first one's going to be called geoAir, and we'll set this equal to a ref with the initial value of null, and then we'll also create one more here, and we're going to call this geoAir and message to store the message that we want to output inside of our modal, and we'll also set this one to null as well. All right, so there we go. So inside of this function, what we want to do is, if we have an error, we want to change this value of geoAir to true. So we'll say geoAir and value, and we'll set this to true. Okay, and for the message, we'll say geoAir message dot value, and we'll set it equal to our error dot message here. All right, so there we go. Now, we'll also need one more function, because when we close our modal, we want to change these two values back to null. So we'll create a new function here, and we'll call this close geoAir like this, and we'll set it to an arrow function here. And then what we want to do is we'll copy this right here to save some time. We'll paste it in here, and we'll change this value to null, and then we'll also change our error message value back to null as well. Now, for us to use this, because we are going to use this inside of our template tags up here in just a moment, we want to return this function. So we'll copy this, and then we'll return it down here inside of our return statement. All right then, so let's actually create our modal here. So how we're going to do this is we're going to create a component for this modal, and then we'll import it here into our home view. All right, so let's come over to our components folder and we'll create a new file and we'll call this geoairmodal.view. And then inside of this file, what we want to do is we're going to scaffold out our boilerplate here. So I'm going to type in view and I'll hit tab, and that should generate our template, our script tag, and our style tag here. Now, since we are going to be using Tailwind, we don't have any need for the style tag, so I'm going to remove that. And for now, inside of our template tag, just to make sure everything's working properly when we import this, I'll just do a few line breaks here. I'll create a new div, and inside of this div, we'll just have an H1 that says testing geo air modal like this. And then we'll head over to our home view and we'll import this component here. So where we want to do this is just above the map. So what we'll say here is geo air and modal, and then we'll close this off here, and then we want to import it here, so we'll say import and we'll do geo air modal and we'll say from, and then we're going to navigate to the components folder, and then we'll say geo air modal, and we can also just negate these two periods here and just say at like that as well, which I think looks a little bit more cleaner. And then the last thing we want to do is then just copy this name we gave it here into our components here. All right, so if we did everything right, we should be able to head over to our application here, and you can now see we have this header tag that we added for testing geo air modal. Okay, so let's begin to style up our modal. So first off, let's remove this H1 as we created it for testing and we don't need it any longer. And then on our initial div here, which I'm going to call our div wrapper, let's add some classes. So first one we're going to pass is hScreen, which is to set the height to 100 VH. We're going to set a position absolute, so we'll say absolute here. And we're also going to set the width to 100%, so we'll say W-full to do that. Then we want to give it a z-index of a little higher than everything else, so to be safe, we'll say z-10 for a z-index of 10. We're going to set the display to flex. We want to justify all the content to the center, so we'll say justify-center. And we also want to align the items to the start, so we'll say items-start here. Okay, and then we're going to use a custom padding value here on the top. So we're going to say PT, and then we're going to say slash, and we're going to use our arbitrary values here. So we're going to surround the value that we want the padding on the top to be inside of these square brackets. So the value we want to pass is 125 pixels. And then the last thing here is we want to give it a background color, which we're going to use black. So we're going to say BG. Black here, but we want to give it an opacity, and to do that we can just say slash, and then we can pass I think values such as 100 for 100% opacity, I believe 75, 50, and then you could even use your arbitrary values here as well, but we're going to go with 50% here. All right, so there's our initial wrapper, and then we'll just do a couple line breaks here. Now inside of this wrapper, we're going to create another div for the actual modal content itself. So what we'll do here is we'll add a few classes to this. So we're going to set the display to flex. We want the flex direction to be a column, so we'll say flex col. We want the background color to be white. And then we're going to give it a width of, once again, another arbitrary value here. So we're going to say 80% here. And then once we get to a small breakpoint or higher, we want to set the width to a fixed amount of 450 pixels. So to reference a breakpoint, we say the breakpoint we want, which is going to be small. Then we'll do a colon, and then the class that we want to add. So we're going to say width, and then we'll do our arbitrary value. And then inside of the square bracket here, we'll say the value we want, which is going to be 450 pixels. Then we'll add some padding to the left and right. So we'll say px-6. And then we'll add some padding to the top and bottom, so we'll say py-4, and then we'll round the corners here with rounded-md. All right. Now, inside of here, we're going to have a header tag, so we'll say h1, and we'll give it a few classes, so we'll say text LG for the font size, and then a margin on the bottom, and we'll say mb1. And here for now, we'll just say error, and then we're going to dynamically output the error, but we'll come back to that. Then the next thing we want to do is we're going to have a paragraph tag here just to kind of further elaborate what's going on with the error. Okay, so we'll add a class of this, and we'll say text sm, and we'll just save that to reformat everything. And then we'll have a margin on the bottom here, and we'll say mb-4. Now for this, what I'll do is I'm just going to copy in the text that we're going to have inside of this paragraph tag. So what it's going to read is going to say, to take advantage of this application's features, please ensure location services are enabled. Okay, now the last thing we're going to add here is going to be our button to close this modal. Okay, so we'll add some classes here. So we'll say self start to align it to the very left hand side so it doesn't take up the full amount of space inside of the modal. Then we'll do some padding on the top and bottom. We'll say py-2, and then some padding on the left and right. So we'll say px-4. And for the color of this button, we'll give it a background of red, and we'll use the value of 500. And then we want the text to be white, so we'll say text-white, and then we'll round the corners with rounded MD, and then we'll give it a text size of small here. Okay, and then for the content inside of the button, we'll just say close. All right, and we probably can capitalize that as well. Okay, so that should do it for the styling. So if we take a look inside of our application now, we should be left with something like this for our modal. Okay, so as of right now, we have a few issues with our modal. So if we head over to our application, the first issue we have is that this modal is always present, and we don't want that. We only want the modal to be visible if we have an error obtaining the user's location. All right, now if we did happen to get an error, we don't have any way to dynamically output the error message that we're receiving back. Okay, and the final issue is here that if we click on this close button, it actually doesn't close the modal. So what we want to do for this is you want to listen for a click on this button here, and then if you recall, we created this function called close geoerr that we want to run to pretty much close our modal. Okay, so the first thing that we can do is we can only show this component if we have a geoerr. So what we'll do is we'll look at this value right here, and we'll say if it's true, then we'll show this component here. So to use these two values inside of our template tag, we need to return them because we will be using this as well to dynamically display that message we're getting. So what we'll do is copy this, and then we want to return it down here inside of our return statement, and then we'll say message like that. Okay, there we go. So on our component here, let's say v-if and only if geoerr is true. So right now it's set to false. So if we head over to our application, we won't see it anymore, which is what we want. Okay, but for testing purposes here, let's just set this to true. All right, so now we should see it again. All right, good. So the next thing we want to do is we want to link up this error message to this component and then display that error message inside of our modal here. So how we'll do this is with what they call a v-bind, and I'm going to use a shorthand for this. So we're going to bind something that we're going to call geoerr message, and we're going to set it equal to our value that we have called geoerr message. All right. And then what we'll do is we'll head over to our modal or our component here, and we want to look for this prop. So inside of our script tag here and inside of the export default, we'll define props. And then what we'll do is we'll look for the geoerr message like this. And then what we can do is we can refer to that here inside of our template tag. So what we'll do is we'll say geoerr message like that. All right, and if we were to come over to, the home view here, and we change this from null to something just for testing, we'll say testing v-bind on modal, we should now see that it's going to say testing v-bind on modal. So that's all working great. Now, the last thing we want to do here is be able to close this modal. So we need to do something they call a emit to listen for something like a click on this component and then do something. So what we can do here is actually an inline emit. So we can say @click here. And then what we want to do is emit, and it should be money sign, not pound sign. So money sign, emit here, and we want to create a custom emit. And what we're going to call this is something logical. We'll say close geoerr because that's what we want to do. Okay, so if we save this and then we come back over to our home view here, then we can listen for that event by saying and then the event name, and what do we want to run when we hear this event. And we want to run a function that we created earlier, like I mentioned here, of close geoerr. And since we already returned it here, we can use it in our template tag. So I'll copy this and then we'll paste it like this. So now if we head back over to our application, we should be able to close this modal, which we can. Okay, so as of right now, if a user didn't want the application to track their location, we don't have a way of handling this. So what we're going to do now is start to implement some of the features that we're going to be adding to our map, starting with the ability to toggle the tracking of a user's location. So how we're going to handle this is we're going to come over to our components folder and we're going to create a new component to handle all of our features here. So we'll call this map features.view. And what we'll do now really quick is to scaffold out a quick view boilerplate here. And then we can remove the style tags here since we're using Tailwind, and I'll just save this. And for now, let's just add a div here with a header tag and say map features like that. All right, so let's come back over to our home view here and let's import this component into our view. So where we're gonna do this is directly below our GeoAir modal. So we'll say map features and then we'll close that off, and then we can just copy the other import here we have from our GeoAir modal, and then I'll just copy the name here, and then we'll select both of this or both of these and we'll paste that in there like that, and then we will also import it here into our components. All right, so if we head back over to our application, we should now see we have that component imported into our view here. Okay, so let's begin to style up our components. So the first thing we'll do here is we'll remove this h1 as we only needed it for testing, and let's begin to add some classes to our initial div here, or the div wrapper I like to call it. Okay, so the first thing we'll say is w-full for a width of 100%, and we will be styling this up for mobile. So what we'll do is once we get to a median breakpoint, I want to adjust the width, and we're going to say w-auto for a width of auto. Now we want to position this component absolute, so we'll say absolute here. Then once we get to a median breakpoint, we want to set the top property and also the left property. So we're going to be using a custom value for the top property here. So we're going to use our square brackets for the arbitrary value, and we'll say 40 pixels. And then once we get to a median breakpoint, again, like I said, we want to set the left property, and once again, we'll be using a custom value here, and we'll say 60 pixels. All right, now the next thing we want to add is a z index. So we're going to use a custom value for this as well, and we're going to say 2. Now for some easier readability, I'm just going to skip a line here for the rest of the classes. So the next thing we want to do is display this div as flex. We want to add some gap between the flex children. So we're going to say gap-4. And then we're going to add some padding on the left and right here on mobile. So we'll say px-6. And then for the padding on the top and bottom, we'll say py-8. Now, once we get to a median breakpoint, I want to remove this padding. So we'll say px-0, medium, and then we'll do py-0. And the last class we want to add here is for the background color, which is going to be transparent. So we'll say bg transparent here. All right, so there we go. Now inside of this div is where we're going to have our geolocation button that we're going to be able to click on to toggle the tracking of the user's location within our map here. So I'll just add a comment here and we'll say geolocation. Okay, so let's create a div to hold this, and let's add a few classes to it. So the first class we'll add here is for some padding, and we'll say padding on the left and right, so px, and we'll use the value of 4. We're going to apply it a background color of white. We want to display this as flex, and then we also want to push all the items to the center. And then we also want to put a shadow on here, so we're going to say shadow-md for a medium shadow. And we also want to round the corners here, so we'll say rounded md. And lastly, we want to give it a minimum height, and we're going to use a custom minimum height. So what we'll do is say min-h, and then dash in our square brackets here, and then we're going to give it a value of 45 pixels. All right, so what we want to do inside of this div is add the icon for our geolocation button. So how we're going to implement the icon is through a service called Font Awesome. So here on my other screen, I have open a website called cdnjs.com, which pretty much has a whole bunch of different libraries you can search up and then add to your project. All right. So what I searched up here is Font Awesome. So what we want to do is copy this link tag here. We want to head back over to our project, and where we want to import this is inside of our public folder and into this index.html file. All right, so we'll paste this in here, and now we'll have access to use the Font Awesome library within our project here. Okay, so here on Font Awesome, I pulled up the icon that we're going to be using. So to use it, as you can see right here, if I hover over this little snippet of code, we can copy the HTML, and then we'll head over to our project and we'll just paste it here inside of our div for our geolocation. Okay, now I do want to add a few classes here. So first off, I want to add a text color here to change the color of the icon. So we're going to use a color of slate, and then we're going to use the value 600. All right, and then I also want to give this a custom font size. So we're going to say text here, and then we'll do 18 pixels like that. All right, and that should do it for the actual styling here for our geolocation button. So if we head over to our application and we click on our client here, you can see we're left with something like this. All right, so let's begin to add some functionality to our location button. So if we head over to the application here, a few things that we want to do is, first off, we want to update the appearance to our button here if we have our location services enabled. Now, the view you're currently seeing is if the location services are disabled. All right, now the next thing we want to do is when we click on this button right here, we want to have the ability to toggle on and off the location services. And the final thing we're going to do is when we are initially fetching the user's location, we want to give them a little bit of a loading animation if it's taking some time. So what we'll do is we'll animate this location icon right here using Tailwind. All right, so let's head back over to our project here, and the first thing we want to do is go back over to our home view because we need to bind up some of our data here to this component. Okay, so what we want to bind up, and let me make sure that we returned them here. So we have returned chords, but we also want to return fetch chords here as well because we're going to be using that one as well. So what we want to do is we'll do the shorthand for binding here. So we'll say chords, and we'll set it equal to chords. And then we also want to bind up fetch chords and set this equal to fetch chords like that. All right. So back here inside of our map features component, we can look for this and we can define props, and then we'll look for chords, and then also, and we'll say fetch chords here. All right, so there we go. Now what we want to do is add some dynamic classes depending on if these values are true or false or have value or not. Okay, so what we first want to do is on this initial div right here, we're going to add a dynamic class. So we'll bind the class right here, and then we'll put it inside of our curly brackets. And the class that we want to bind here is going to be the background color. So we're going to say BG slate, and we're going to use the value of 600. Now we only want to apply this class if we have our coordinates. So we'll say only apply this if chords is true. Okay, so now if we head over to the application, you should be able to see if we maybe do a refresh here that our button background has now changed because the coordinates are currently true and they have value. Okay, so as you can see right now, the icon is black, and that's doesn't really stand out well, so we want to change that as well. So what we'll do here is we'll do something very similar on this icon. So we'll bind up a class here, and what we want to say is we'll do text dash white, and we'll say only apply this class if the chords are true. Okay, and there we go. Now what we also want to do is we want to add a little bit of a loading animation to our icon here if the coordinates are fetching. So what we'll do here is we'll do a comma, and we're going to add another class. Now Tailwind already has some custom animation set up for us, and to make it easy for this project, we're just going to use one of those, and we're not going to alter anything. So the animation that we're going to be using is called a pulse. So we can add this to this icon by saying the class animate and dash pulse here. Okay, and we only want to apply this class if fetch chords is true. So I'll just copy this to avoid any spelling issues here. So there we go. Now currently this is going to be false, so we're not going to see this actually animate here. So what we can do is go back over to our home view, and just to kind of show you what this is going to look like, let's just change this fetch chords value to true here. And all right, I think that should work. And as you can see now, our icon is going to pulse while we are fetching the user's location. Okay, so now the last thing we need to do is have the ability to toggle on and off the user's location when they click on this button. So let's head over to our project, and where we want to begin is inside of our map features component here. Now what we want to do is we want to listen for a click on our button, and when we hear that click we want to emit a custom event. So we'll do an inline emit just like we did earlier, and then the event that we want to emit is going to be called get geolocation. Okay, so we'll save that, and then we'll head over to our home view here. So we want to listen for this event on our component here. So to do this, we'll just say @ and then the event name, and then we want to run the function called get geolocation, which we already have created here inside of our view. So in order for us to use this function, we first need to return it here. So we'll return it as well. So with currently how everything is set up, if we head over to our application, this actually won't do anything. So as you can see, I'm clicking the button and nothing happens here. So what we need to do is a few updates to our get geolocation function here. So let's expand this. And the first thing we want to do before we run anything is we want to run an if check here. Now what we're going to check for is we're going to see if this chords data value has value or it doesn't. So what we'll say here is if chords.value is true when we run this function, then we want to remove the user's location. Okay, so what we'll do is first off, we'll say chords.value, and we'll set this equal to null. All right, now we are also storing the user's coordinates inside of session storage, so we want to remove those as well. So to do this, we'll say session storage dot remove item, and we want to remove the item called chords. Okay, now the last thing we need to do is we have the user's location plotted on our map, and we're storing that here inside of this data value called geomarker. So to remove it, what we'll say is we'll reference our map, and then we're going to call the method remove layer, and then what we want to do is you want to remove our geomarker. So we'll say geomarker dot value here, and that should remove the marker from the map. And then what we also want to do is after this runs, we just want to return out of the function because we don't want anything else to run after this. Okay, so that should do it. If we save it and head back over to our application, we should now be able to toggle on and off the user's location. Okay, so let's give this a try here. So if we click on our button now, what should happen is you can see that the marker is removed, and now our button goes back to its initial state here. That indicates that the user's location is disabled, and if we click on it again, you can see that it re-adds the user's location here. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to be adding to our map features component is the ability to make a search request. So we're finally going to be interacting with our backend route that we created earlier on within this video. So let's begin with the markup and styling for our search request. So what we'll do here is we'll collapse our HTML for the geolocation, and then we'll create a new comment here for our search. Okay, so right below this, let's create our new div, and then on this initial div, let's add a few classes. So we want to position this relative, so I'll give it a class of relative. We're also going to pass it a class of flex-1, and then on a medium breakpoint or higher, we want to give it a minimum width. So we're going to say min-w, and then we're going to use a custom value here. So we're going to say 350 pixels. Okay. Now, inside of this div, first off, what we want to create is going to be the input itself. So I'll add a little comment here for input. So we'll create a new input tag here, and by default, it has a type of text, which we'll keep, and then we want to add a few classes. So I'll do this actually before the type. So what we're going to do is first off, we're going to have some padding on the left, and we're going to have a higher value for this, and we're going to say -9, and you'll see why in just a moment. Then we'll have some padding on the right, so we'll say PR, and then we'll do the value of 4. And then we want some padding on the top and bottom, so we're going to say PY-3. The text size, we're going to go a little bit smaller here, so we're going to say text-SM. And then what we want to do on the focus state here is I want to remove the outline, and you can choose to add a different color if you want to, but I'm just going to remove the outline completely here. And I know a lot of people say this is bad accessibility, but just for this project, I think it looks a little bit better, but feel free to add a custom border or something like that, but I'm just going to remove it. Then we want it to take up the full amount of space available, so we'll pass w-full, and then we're going to add a shadow with a medium shadow here, and then we'll round the corners with a rounded MD here. All right, and then what I want to do next here is just a little placeholder, and we're going to say start your search like that. All right, and that'll be it for the input for now. We'll come back and add the model and all the other functions in a little bit. And we're just going to get the HTML and styling out of the way here. So the next thing we want to add is going to be the search icon, which we're going to position absolute here, which is why we have this extra padding on the left-hand side of the input here. So let's add our comment for our search icon. So right below this, let's create another div, and then let's add a few classes to this div. So first off, we want to position this div absolute. So we'll say absolute here. Then we want to give it a top property of 0. Then we're going to give it a left property of a custom value here, and we're going to say 8 pixels. All right. Then we want to give it a class of hfull for 100% height. Then we're going to display this as flex, and we want to align the items to the center here. And then inside of this div, we want to grab our icon from Font Awesome. So if we go to the next screen here and we go to my other tab, I already have this pulled up. So we'll copy this HTML here for our search icon, go back over to our project, and we'll paste this in here. All right, so with all this HTML that we added, we should now have ourselves a nice little search input within our application. So if we switch over to the other screen here within our browser, you can now see we have something like this. Okay, so the final thing that we need to add to our search results feature is something to display the results we get returned back from our API. So where we'll do this is right below our search icon. We'll add a comment and we'll say search results. Okay, and then we'll create a new div. So we want to pass a few classes here. So first off, we want to position this absolute. And we want to apply some margin on the top, so we'll say mt-2, and we also want to set the width to 100%, so we'll do this with a class of w-full. So let's open up this div, and we'll add a new comment here, and this will be for the results, and let's create a div to store these in. So let's add a few classes to this as well. So first off, you want to give this a fixed height of 200 pixels. Now the next thing we want to do is add an overflow class here, and we're going to set it to scroll. So we'll use a class of overflow scroll. Now what this is going to do is when the content exceeds 200 pixels that's within this div, it'll just be scrollable. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Then we want to add a class of BG white, and lastly we'll add a class of rounded MD. So what we want to do inside of this div is output each individual result that we receive back from our API. So to do this, we'll create another div and we'll apply a few classes here. So we want to do some padding on the left and right, and we'll give it a value of 4. We want to do some padding on the top and bottom, and we'll say a value of 2. We want to display this as flex. Then we want to add some gap on the x-axis with a value of 2. And then we want to change the cursor to a pointer with a class of cursor pointer. Now we also want to add some hover effects here to when you hover over the div, we change the background color, and we're going to change it to the color of, or with a class of BG-slate, and we'll say 600. Now what we also want to do on hover is update the text color. So we'll target hover again, and then we'll say text-white to update the color to white on hover. Okay, so there we go. Now inside of this div, what we're going to do is we're going to have an icon, which is going to be this right here from Font Awesome. So what I'll do is I'll copy this and we'll paste it inside of this div here. And then we also want to output the result returned back from our API, which we don't have at the moment. So what we'll do for now is we'll just output some dummy data. So we'll just say testing result like this. And we want to apply a few classes to this paragraph tag as well. So, or actually just one, and we'll do a text XS class here for a text size of a little smaller than normal. Okay, and that should do it. So if we head over to our application now and we change over to our client tab here, you can see we're left with something like this. And when we hover over it, you can see the background color changes, and so does the text color. Okay, so let's begin to implement some functionality into our search results feature. So the first thing we need to do is obtain the value that the user's typing here inside of this input. So we need to do some two-way binding. So let's come down to our script tag here and let's create our setup function. All right, and then what we also want to do is, since we're going to be using a ref here to create our data, we want to import that here into this component. So import ref from view. All right, and then let's create our data. So the first piece of data we're going to create is for the search value that the user is typing. So we'll call this search query, and we'll set it equal to a ref with the initial value of null. Now, while we're creating some data, let's also create the data value that we're going to store our results from our API, and we're also going to have one more data value for a set timeout method that we're going to be creating as well. So I'll copy this down 2 more times, and we'll just change this from query to data. And then we also have another one, like I said, for a set timeout, which we're going to call query timeout. Okay. Now, to use all of these values inside of our template tag, which we will be using these two, but to avoid an error, we can just return this one as well for now. So we'll return this, and then we'll say search query, search data, and also our query timeout. All right. And then what we need to do is come up to the input tag here, and we'll use a v model, and we'll say search query. So now whenever the user types inside of this input, we'll be storing that value inside of this data value here. Okay, so now that we have that, we have everything we need to make our request to our API. So let's create a function to handle that. So we'll call this function search, and then we'll set equal to our arrow function. So how we're going to be making our request to our API is through what they call a lazy search. And what that means is as the user is typing, we're going to wait for them to stop typing for a certain amount of time, and then we'll make our request. So we're not going to have to hit enter or anything like that. It's going to be based off the user typing inside of the input. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So what we want to do is we want to create a new set timeout method and set it equal to our data value here of query timeout. So let's begin with that. So we'll say query timeout dot value is going to be equal to a new set timeout method, which takes in a callback, and then it also takes in the duration you want to wait before executing the callback here. So what we're going to say for this is 750 milliseconds, and then let's open up our callback here. So what we want to do inside of here is, first off, we want to check to make sure that the search value is not equal to null. So we'll say search, let's do query dot value is not equal to an empty string here. Okay, so if it's not equal to an empty string, then we'll run the code inside of this function, which is going to be reaching out to our API. So first off, I'm going to create a new variable for our parameters just to make our call a little bit cleaner. So we'll say params, and then we'll set equal to a new, and we'll do URL search params. Okay, and this is very similar to what we created inside of our backend. So the first parameter that we're going to pass here is going to be called fuzzy match, which we talked about, which will just help with spelling issues. If you spell something wrong, it'll still look for, or try to look for, what the user was searching for. And we'll set this to true. Then we also want to set the language here, and we'll say EN. Then we're also going to set a limit, which we'll do of 10. And the next thing we want to add is going to be our proximity here. So what we want to set for our proximity is going to be this prop that we have of chords. So to access that value of chords here inside of our setup function, we need to pass props as a parameter here. Okay, so what we're going to say is we're going to first check to make sure that this prop of chords is actually true, because remember, we always don't have a value here if the user turned off the location. So we'll check if it's true. Now, if it is true, then what we'll do is we'll use those coordinates here as the value of our proximity parameter. So we'll use some interpolation, and then we'll say our money sign and our brackets, and we'll say props.chords.lng for our longitude, and then we'll do the same thing here for our latitude. So we'll do props.chords.lat like that. Now, so this is if it's true. Now, if it's false, then what we want to do is we're just going to output the param here to be 0 and then 0. Okay, and that's going to be our parameters here. So what we want to do next is make our actual request to our API. So to do this, we're going to be using Axios. So first off, let's import Axios here into our component. So import Axios from, and then Axios. Okay, so now back here inside of our function, what we also want to do is on this set timeout method, we have our callback. Now, what we're going to do is we need to await the data that we're going to be returned from our API. So we want to make this callback asynchronous. So we'll just throw async here in front of our callback function. Okay, so where we'll make our request is right below our params here. So we'll create a variable to store our request in, and we'll call this get data, and we'll set equal to a wait, and we'll do axios.get. And then we'll do some backticks here because we are going to be doing some interpolation. So where we want to make this request to is currently the server is on our local host. And if we go to our terminal here, you can see we have it on port 3000. So we're going to say HTTP localhost, and then we'll do colon, and then the port 3000. And then the endpoint we want to hit is going to be API, and then we'll do slash, and then we'll say search here. And then we'll do another slash, and then we want to tack on here the search query that the user typed into our input. So we will say search query dot value. And then what we want to do is tack on this variable we have here, our params, as a query string. So what we'll do is we'll do a question mark, and then we'll do some our money sign and our brackets again to attach this, and we'll say params here. All right, so there we go. That is going to be our request. So what we want to do is then we're going to get back the results, and we want to store them here in this data value of search data. So what we'll do is we'll say search data dot value is going to equal get data dot data, and we're going to say the features array. So we'll say features like this. All right, so there we go. Now to see this, what we want to do, or what we can do for now, is just log this out to the console. So we'll say console.log here, and we'll do search data.value. Okay. Now, before we wrap up this function and test it, what we want to do is, because like I mentioned, this is going to be what we call a lazy search. So once a user stops typing, then we want to wait for it to time out and then run this code here inside of our set timeout callback. Okay, so what we'll do is, this is why we stored the set timeout here inside of this data value called query timeout. So every time this function runs, we want to clear the previous timeout that would be currently running. So to do this, we'll say clear timeout, and then we're going to say query timeout dot value here. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. So if we save this, I believe everything should work. Well, actually, what we want to do is we want to make this function fire each time the user types in the input field. So what we first want to do is return this down here so that we can use it inside of our template tag. So we'll just say search here. Then we want to head up to our markup, and we want to listen for when this input here changes, and when it does, we want to run our function of search. So the event that we're going to listen to is called input here. So we'll listen for this by saying @ and then we'll say input. And then each time that the input changes, we want to run our search function here. All right, so let's head over to our application and test this out. Okay, so let's give this a try, and first off, let's just open up our console here so that we can see the results. So we'll inspect and go to our console, and let's do a search. So let's say we want to go grab some coffee, and we're looking for a Starbucks, so we'll say Starbucks like that, and there you go. We can see we get back a result here. So if I open this up, you can see that inside of here we have all the results that match our search term of Starbucks. So now that we have our results returned back from our API, we can dynamically output them here within this display that we created for our search results, where right now we just have some static data. Now, before we do that, I want to solve one issue here. So as you can see, this little display we have for our results is always shown, and that's not what we want. So what we can do is actually on this div right here that's wrapping our result, we can add a if condition here, and we can only show this if we have a search query in the input. Okay, so now if we head back over to our application, you can see we're no longer going to see this, but as soon as we start typing in here, you can see that it's going to appear. All right, so that's much better. Now, let's dynamically output our results that we get returned back. So what we'll do is we'll actually iterate over all the results using a v for loop here. So we'll pass some parentheses here. So we're going to say for each result that we have inside of our array. We'll call this result, and then we'll pass an index here, and then we'll say in, and then we'll do search data, which is where we're storing all the results, if you recall, from our API here. Okay, and we have access to use this because we already returned it here. So you can see we're still getting an error here because we have to pass a key, so that's where the index will come in handy. So we'll just say the key and we'll set it equal to the index. All right, there we go. So what we want to do here is we want to do some curly brackets here, and we're going to say result, and we want to look for the value of place underscore name, and we'll say underscore en. And that's all we need to do. So if we head over to our application now and we perform a search, so once again, let's say Starbucks here, we should now see all of our results here inside of our display. Okay, so one issue that we have with our search results here is if we go to perform a new search, as you can see, for a brief moment we just had this blank white box here, which in my opinion isn't a very good user experience. Now, what I think would be better is as we're typing here, instead of having a blank white box, we should display a nice loading animation to let the user know that we're making a search request. All right, so let's head back over to our project here, and what we first want to do is create a component for our loading spinner. So create a new file, and we'll call this loading spinner.view. Now to save some time, what I'm going to do is just copy and paste in this component here. It's pretty simple. So if you want to grab this component, you can either head over to the GitHub repository and download this component directly, or what I'll do is if you want to just copy it, you can pause the video and I'll minimize this, and then I will add this to the next line. That way you can see the entire component here. Okay, so what we'll do next is we'll save this first off, and then we want to head over to the map features component here, which is where we're going to be implementing this loading component. So first off, let's import this here into our component. So we'll say import loading spinner from, and then we'll just say /, and we have our loading spinner, and we haven't defined our components here, so let's do that. And then we'll say loading spinner like this, and we'll put a comma there. All right, so where we're going to implement this is within our results here. So what we'll do is we'll add a comment here. So we'll say, we'll do loading, and then we'll import our loading component here. So we'll say loading, we'll do loading spinner like that. Okay, so what we want to do is we only want to show this loading spinner if our search data is null. So we'll have a v-if here, and we'll say only show this if our search data equates to null. Okay, and we also want to do something similar here for our results. So we only want to show this if we have search data. Now, if we go to directly add a v-if here on a div that already has a v4, you're going to see we're going to have this little red error here. And the reason is you're not supposed to use a v-if with a v4. So what we'll do is we'll just wrap this div with another div to avoid that issue. So we'll collapse this here, and then we'll create a new div here, and then we'll just wrap it. Okay, so there we go. Now, we have two options here for displaying this data. So first off, we could just do something logical, which you would say v-if and only show this if we have search data. That would work fine. But since we're already looking at the search data value right here in this condition, we could just use a v-else to simplify this. Okay, so we'll do that. All right, now before we go and test this out, I do want to make one update to our search function here. So currently we're not clearing out the search each time we perform a new one. So what I want to do is just clear that out. So what we'll do here is we'll say search data dot value is going to equal null here. All right, so there we go. So let's head over to our application and test this out. Okay, so let's perform a new search request here, and when we do, initially we should see our loading animation until we have the result returned back from our API. So let's make a search, and as you can see, we have our loading animation, and once we have our data, it disappears, and now we have our search results here. So that is all working great. So now that we have the ability to make a search request, we also want to be able to take our result here, click on it, and plot that location here on the map. So let's head over to our project and begin to implement this. So where we want to begin here is on the div with our result. We want to listen for a click here. So we'll say @click, and then we want to run a function we haven't created yet called select result. And we also want to pass along that specific result that we clicked on. So we'll say result here. All right, so then let's go ahead and create our function. So we'll do this right below our search. So we'll call this function select result, and we'll set equal to an arrow function. Now we also want to accept here as a param the result. And then to use this function within our template tag, we want to return it here. So for now, what we're going to be doing, we'll add a little bit more to this function later, but for now, we're just going to emit a custom event that we're going to listen to or listen for on our home view here. And then when we hear that, we'll create another function there to plot that location on our map. Now to emit from within our setup function here, we want to use the context param, which exposes 3 properties. And the one we're going to be using is emit, and we're not going to be using the other 2. So what we can do is just destructure this, and we can grab the emit out of here. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Then to emit, we'll just say emit like this, and then the event we want to create, which is going to be plot result here. And then we want to send over the result.geometry, which is going to be the coordinates of the location that the user selected. Okay, so there we go. Now what we want to do is head over to our home view and listen for this event, and then run a function that's going to plot that location on our map. Okay, so let's listen for our custom event here. So we'll say and the name we gave it was plot result. Now, when we hear this event, what we want to do is we want to run a function we haven't created yet called plot result. Okay, so let's create this function here, and where we'll do it is right below our closed geo array. So we'll say const and then plot result, and we'll set it equal to an arrow function here. Now what we want to do is also accept as a parameter the payload that we're sending over, which is going to be the coordinates. So I'll call this param coords. All right, and then to use this function, we also want to return it here. Now, very similar to how we did with our plot geolocation, we created a data value here to store the marker in, and we're going to do the same thing here for our results. So we'll create a new data value, and we'll call this results marker, and we'll set it equal to a ref with the initial value of null. All right, now the first thing that we want to do within this function is we want to check to see if this data value of result marker already has value, because later on in the function we're going to set this result marker equal to a new marker and then plot it on the map, and we only want to plot one result on the map at a time. Okay, so let's add a comment here, and we'll say check to see if result marker has value. So we'll perform an if check here, and we'll say result marker dot value, and if this equates to true, that means we have a marker stored inside of this data value. So what we want to do is reference our map, and we're going to call the remove layer method here, and we'll say results marker dot value like that. So if we call this function and we already have a marker plotted, it'll remove it from the map before we add the new one. Okay, so now for the remaining portion of this function, it's going to be very similar to what we did here inside of our plot geolocation function. So to save some time, what I'll do is just copy the function here from our plot geolocation, and then we'll copy it here into our plot result function, and we'll make a few changes. So for the first thing here, we have the custom marker. So we want to change the icon here for this. So if we go into our assets folder here, you can see that we have the marker red, which we're using, and we also have the marker blue, which is what we're going to be using for plotting our results. So instead of saying red here, we'll change this to blue. Okay, so there we go. Now, instead of setting geomarker.value equal to our new marker, we'll say result marker.value, and we'll set it like this. Now, for the actual coordinates here, we need to change this up as well. So we'll keep it as coords here, but on the array that we're going to be returning from our API, it's not going to look exactly like this. It's actually stored inside of an array called coordinates here. So we'll say coordinates, and we want the actually the second value here for the latitude, and then for the longitude it's going to be the first value. So we'll copy this and then we'll paste it in there like that. Okay, and that should be that. And we need to do the same thing down here for this as well. So let's copy this and we'll paste it inside of our set view here. Okay, so actually it looks like I spelled coordinates wrong here. So before we paste it in here, let's change this. So we'll fix that and we'll fix that. And also it appears that this is set to 1 as well here in the array order. So we want to also update this to 0. All right, so now we can copy this and we'll paste it into our set view here, and that should do it for the function here for plotting our result on the map. So now if we head over to our application and we make a search and we find a result that we want to select, we should be able to plot that result on our map. Alright, so let's give this a try and let's make a search request here and we'll look up a Starbucks and we get our results here. So let's select the second one here, and as you can see it plots it on the map. Now one thing I think we should do is increase the zoom level when we select a result here. So let's fix that. So where we want to update this here is where we set the map view to the current location. So currently we're setting the zoom level to 10. Let's try something like 14 and see how that looks. So let's head back here. We'll do another search for Starbucks and we'll click the second one, and there we go. That looks a lot better. So now let's see what happens if we select another result here from our list. So as you can see, if I select this one, it's going to remove that marker here and it's going to plot the new one. So that way we only have one selected result on our map at a time. Okay, so currently when you select a result from our list here, what happens is we plot the marker on the map, we zoom in the map, but this list of results stays open. Now, what I think should happen is when you select a result here, the list should close. Okay, now what I also think we should do is when we interact with the map, such as moving around here or zooming in, I think we should also close up the results here that we have if they're open. Alright, so let's head over to our project and begin to implement that. Okay, so how we're going to handle this is we'll create a data value here inside of our home view. Then what we'll need to do is bind that data value up here to our map features to pretty much control whether or not we hide or show the list of search results. Alright, so hopefully that makes sense. So let's come down here to our script tag and create our data value. So we'll call this search and results, and we'll set it equal to a ref with the initial value of null. Now what I'm going to do here is create a few functions that we're going to need to manipulate this value here. So the first function is going to be called toggle search results, and we'll set equal to an arrow function here. And all we want to do is have a little toggler in here. So what we'll do is say search results dot value is equal to the opposite of whatever it is. So it'll pretty much toggle it from being true to false or false to true. So hopefully that makes sense. So we'll say search results dot value here. And that's our first function. Now the second function we're going to create here is going to be for strictly closing the search results or setting it to null. So we'll call this close search results here, and we'll set this equal to an arrow function as well. And we'll just say search results dot value is going to equal null here. All right, so we need to access these two functions and also this data value inside of our template. So we want to return all of these. So we'll return our search results, we'll return the toggle search results, and we'll also toggle the close search results here. All right, so there we go. Okay, so what we want to do is bind our search results value here to this component. So we'll say search results and we'll set it equal to the search results value. All right, so we'll save that. Then we'll head over to our map features component here, and we first off want to look for this prop here. So we'll say a comma and then we'll say search results here. So what we'll do with this is we'll head up here to where we have this div for our results, and we already have a if condition on here for our search query. So now what we'll say is we only want to show this if the search query is true, but we also want to say only if the search results value is true as well. So these both have to be true for us to show the results here. All right, so with currently how everything is set up, if we head over to our application here, you can see if we start to type in our input, nothing happens. So currently it's broke. So the issue is we have nothing that's triggering our value of search results to become true. So what we want to do is we want to head up here to our input and we want to listen for a focus event, which means that the user has focus into this input here, and then we want to toggle the search results to be true. Okay, so what we'll do here is we'll create a custom event which we'll emit. So we'll say add focus, which is the event we want to listen for. Then we'll say money sign, because we're going to do an inline emit here. We'll say emit. And then the event that we want to emit is going to be called toggle search results here. And then what we'll do is we'll just copy this, we'll save it, and then we'll head over to our home view here, and we're going to listen for this event. So we'll say and the event name was toggle search results. And what we want to run when we hear this event is the function we created earlier called toggle search results here. So if you scroll down here, you can see that this function is going to change the value from whatever it is, which currently is false, to the opposite, which will be true. All right, so if we save this and head over to our application now, we should see when we start typing, we once again have our list of results here. So to close our list of results when we're selecting one, what we want to do is insert this function right here of close search results into our function called plot result here. So what I'll do is I'll copy this and then I'll expand this function, and where we want to include this is at the very end here. So we'll just paste it in here like that, and that should close the search results when we select one. So let's save this and let's test it out here. So let's search up and we'll just do Starbucks. And then we want to select one here, and when we do, we should see that the list of results is now closed. Okay, so what we also wanted to do was whenever we interacted with our map, if our search results were open, we wanted to close them. So how we'll handle this is we're going to come here inside of our on-mounted lifecycle hook, and we want to add a listener to our map. So let me do a few line breaks here. And what we want to say is reference our map, and then we'll say on, and the event we want to listen for is called move end. And whenever we hear this event, we want to run our callback here. Now, what we want to run here is our function we have for closing our search results, and that's all we need to do. So if we head over to our application and we test this out, so let's make a search here, and we'll say Starbucks, and let's spell that right. And if we were to pan the map now with our search results open, you'll see that they'll close. Alright, so the last little feature that we're going to implement into our map is something to display the selected result. So as of right now, if we perform a search here, so we'll say Starbucks, and we select a result here, we have no way of knowing what we just selected. So what we're going to add is a little component here that's going to display our selected result. So let's head over to our project and begin to add that. Okay, so for this feature, we're back here inside of our server really quickly, and we're here within our search results.js file. And what we need to do is some manipulation on the data that we're getting returned back here from our API. And to save some time, what I'll do is just copy and paste in this manipulation here. Alright, so what we're doing is we're looping through our features here, and we're referring to each item inside of this array as item. Now, first off, what we're doing here inside of this for each loop is we're creating two new data values called city and state, and we're initially setting these values to null. Then what we're doing is on this item, there is another array called context, which just has some additional information such as a city, state, and other little things like that. So we're going to loop through that array here, and we're going to refer to each item as type. Then what we're going to do is we're going to check for the city and the state here. So for the city, what we want to check for on the ID is a value of place. So if that ID has a value of place, then we'll update the item.city here to the type.text. And the same thing applies here for the region. So if it includes region, then we'll update the state value here to type.text. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so here within our application, we're still logging out to the console the search data that we get returned back from our API here. So if we make a new search, we'll just say Starbucks here, and we should see the results here inside of our console. So now if I inspect this here and we open up this and we see all of our features here, for example, on the first one now, we should see we have the city value that's set to Orlando, and then we have the state value here set to Florida. Okay, so back here inside of our map features component, we need to create a data value that's going to store the user selected result. So let's first begin with that. So we'll create a new variable here, and we'll call this selected result, and then we'll set it equal to a ref with the initial value of null. Now what we want to do with this value is when a user selects a result from the list, we run this function right here of select result. So all we'll do is we'll say the selected result dot value, and we'll set it equal to the result that the user clicked on, which is this result param right here. So we'll set it equal to result here. Then the last thing we need to do so that we can access this inside of our template tags is we want to return it here. So we'll say selected results. Okay, so now that we have that, what we need to do is generate our display that we're going to use to show the selected result. So where we're going to put this is right below our list of results here. So I'm going to minimize this for now, and then we'll add a new comment here and we'll say selected search result like that. And then let's create a new div. Now, first off here, we only want to show this div if we have a selected result. So we'll do a v-if condition here, and we're only going to show this if this value of selected result is true. Okay, so next up here, let's add some classes. So we'll add some margin to the top. So we'll say mt-2. We'll do some padding on the left and right. So we'll say px3, some padding on the top and bottom. We'll do a value of 3 as well. And actually, this should be 4 for the padding on the left and right. Then we'll add a background color of white, and then we'll also round the corners here with a class of rounded MD. Now, inside of here, the first thing we're going to add is an icon that we're going to use to remove the user selected result if they don't want to see it anymore. So let's go over to Font Awesome here, and we're going to be using this icon called Times Circle. So what we'll do is copy the HTML here, and then we'll paste it inside of this div. And I also want to apply the class of flex here to display this as flex. And to justify it on the right hand side of our box, we'll use the class justify end. Now the next thing we're going to add is a header tag here to display the name of the location that the user has selected. And we'll add a class here and we'll say text LG. Now what we're going to output here, and I don't know why I did that, let's scroll back down, and what we're going to output is going to be the actual name of the location. So how we'll access this is we're going to say our selected result here, and we should be able to get a value off here called text. Okay, so that's going to be our header. Now the next thing we want to display is things like the address, the city, and the state. So we'll store these inside of a paragraph tag, and we'll apply a few classes, and we're going to give it the class of text-xs, and we'll also apply a margin on the bottom, so we'll do mb-1 here. Now for the actual address here, how we'll access this is once again we'll get the selected result here. We should have an object on here called properties, so we'll grab that. And then within here, what we have is a value called address. Okay. Now the next thing we want to display is going to be our city. So if you recall, we should be able to once again do our curly brackets here, and then we'll say selected result, and we created this value called city. Okay. Now the last thing we want to display is going to be the state. So we'll do the same thing, and we can access our value we created of state here. All right, and there we go. Now the last thing we're going to add is going to be the category, and once again we'll store this inside of a paragraph tag here, and we'll apply a class of text xs again, and then what we'll do is our curly brackets, and we'll do our selected result, and we can go back into our properties here, and then we'll add the value of category. All right, and there we go. So that should do it for our little display here for our selected search results. So now if we head over to our application and we select a result, we should now see our selection here within the application. Now, really quick before we test things, we want to be able to also remove the selected result when we click on this icon here, which right now we don't have set up. So before we test anything, let's add that. So what we want to do is listen for a click on this icon. So we'll say at, and then click, and then we want to run a function which we need to create here, which is going to be remove result. So let's head down here to our script tag and create this function. So let's collapse this, and we'll collapse this. So let's create a new function here, and we'll call this remove result, and we'll set it equal to a arrow function. So the first thing we want to do is we want to take our selected result, and we want to change the value back to null. Okay. Now what we also need to do is when we click on this and we want to remove the result, we also have to remove it from the map, which we're going to need to do a custom event here that we're going to omit. So we'll also say omit here, and we'll say remove result. Now for us to use this function, we also want to return it. So now the next thing we need to do is head over to our home view, and we want to listen for this custom event here of remove result, and then we want to run a function which is going to remove the result from our map. Okay, so let's listen for our custom event here. So we'll say at and then remove result. And then what we want to do is run a function we haven't created yet called remove result here. So we'll head down to the script tag here, and where we'll do this is we'll come right down to the bottom here. That's fine. And we'll create our function, and we'll set equal to an arrow function here. Now what we want to do is something very similar to what we've already done. Is we're going to say map dot remove layer here, and we're just going to take our result marker dot value, and we're going to remove it here. All right, and then lastly, we just want to return this down here so we can access it inside of our template tag. So that should do it. So now let's head over to our application and test this out. So let's make a new search here, and we'll look for a Starbucks, and we'll get our results here, and let's just click on the second one here. So it plots our marker, zooms in, and now you can see here we have our selection here. So if we go to maybe select a new one here, it's going to actually go below our list of results, and if we click a new one, you can see that it's going to change here. And if we no longer want to look at this result or this location, we can just close it like that. Alright, so that's going to wrap it up for our application. Now the next thing we want to do is actually deploy this to Heroku. So before we can begin our deployment to Heroku, we need to do a few things here within our application. So what we want to do first is I'm going to collapse this src folder here, and we want to navigate to a file that we have here inside of our client called viewconfig.js here. Now, when we deploy this, what we're going to do is actually only deploy our server here. We're going to serve up a static folder, which is going to be the build that Vue creates for us. So we don't want to build our application here into our client folder. We want to build it here into our server folder. So we need to change what they call the output directory here. So to save some time, I'll just copy and paste this in here. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the output directory here to path.resolve, and we want the directory name. And then we're going to store it inside of our server folder here and inside of a folder called public. Okay. So what we want to do next is then head over to our server here, and we want to open up our index.js file, and we want to set up the ability for Express to serve our folder here. So what we'll do is we'll come right below our routes here, and to save some time, I'm just going to copy and paste this in here. Alright, so what we're doing here is I have a little comment to say handling production, and we're going to check if the env var of node env is equal to production. Now, if this is true, then we're going to say app.use, and we're going to say express.static, and we're going to navigate to this public folder that we're going to be creating inside of our server here. Okay, so here inside of our map features component, when we make a call to our backend here, we're hitting the URL of HTTP, localhost, and port 3000. Now, when we deploy this to Heroku, we won't have access to this URL here. So what we actually want to do on our deployment is we just want to hit the route of API/search and then everything else we had beyond this. Okay, and then we can also remove this console.log statement here. Now, if we head over to our application and we try to test this out, what you're going to see happen here is we're actually not going to get any results returned. And if we check our console, we're currently going to be getting a 404 here. So what we want to do is set up on our development server what they call a proxy. So where we'll create this proxy is going to be here inside of our viewconfig.js. Now, before we do anything with our proxy, what I just realized is we used the path module here, but we never imported it. So this will actually give us an error once we restart our server. So we want to say const path is going to be equal to, we'll do require, and we'll say path here. Okay, so we need that because on our output directory here, we are using that. All right, so anyways, getting back to our proxy on our dev server, what we want to do is I'll copy and paste this in to save some time. So what we need to specify here is an object called dev server, and then within here we have another object called proxy. And then what we want to do is we're targeting anything that has /API, and we're going to set a target here to our local host port 3000, which is where we have our server running on our local environment. So if we save this and then we open up our terminal here, and then we want to do a restart here, so we'll say npm run serve again to restart our development server here. Okay, so that finished here. So now if we head back over to our application and we try to make a query here in our search results, you should see that it now works correctly here within our local environment still. Okay, so the last thing that we need to do before we can deploy to Heroku is we need to actually build our application. Now, before we do that, really quick, what I just remembered that I want to do is I want to add a title to our app here. So let's head into our public folder here, and then we want to change our title right here. So we'll remove this and we'll add in here Geocoding View 3 app. All right, so now, like I was saying, the last thing we need to do is build our application here. So what we'll do is we'll open up our terminal, and let's just open up a new one here. And then we want to cd into our client folder here. So we'll do client, and then we want to run the command npm run build, which should build our application, and it should store it here inside of our server. Okay, so this completed here, and if we head into our server folder now, we can see we have this public folder, and if we expand this, it has our built application. Okay, so now with that complete, we're ready to begin deploying our application to Heroku. So how we're going to be deploying this is using the Heroku CLI. So if you don't have that installed currently on your system, be sure to pause the video really quick and install that prior to continuing on with this portion of the tutorial. Okay, so I have opened up a new terminal here. So what we want to do is cd into our server. Okay. Then, using the Heroku CLI, we get access to this command of Heroku and login, which is going to log us into our Heroku account here. So once we run that, we can see that we get this message here to press any key to open up the browser and log in, and we can hit this button right here to log in. And if we head back over to our terminal now, you can see that we're now logged in under our account here. So the next thing we need to do is create a new Heroku project. Now we have two options that we can use to create a new project. The first one is using the Heroku CLI, or we can head over to Heroku, and on our dashboard we have access to create a new project that way. Now I do find it easier to create a project using the Heroku CLI, so that's what we're going to do here. So what we want to say is Heroku, and we just want to specify create here, and that's going to create us a new project here. And as you can see, it gives it a random name. So the name of the project is called Agile Waters, and then it has a number here. So if we go over to our browser, I have my dashboard pulled up here on the other tab. If I do a refresh here, you should now see we have our new project. So let's select our project here, and what it's going to do is take us to a little dashboard for our project. And what we want to do first off here is go to our deploy tab. Now here it gives us instructions on how we can deploy our application to Heroku. So the first step we needed to do was cd into our project, which we already did. Now the next thing we want to do is initialize a new Git repository. So we'll copy this, we'll head back over to our project, and we'll run the command of git init here. And that's going to initialize a new Git repository. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to add what they call a remote to our Git repository here using this command. So we'll copy this, we'll head back over to our project here, and we'll just paste this command in here like that. And as you can see, we have set our remote here to our Heroku project. So the next thing we want to do is a git add all to add all the files to our repository. So what we'll do here is we'll say git add, and then we'll do all. And then the next thing we want to do is commit our changes here. So what we'll say is git commit, and then we'll have a message here, and what we'll have it say is deploying our app. Okay, so as you can see, it added all those files here. So the last thing we then need to do is actually push up all our changes here, or push up our repository to Heroku itself. So we'll copy this command, and then we'll paste it in here, and that should start deploying our application to Heroku. Okay, so that has finished, and now our application has been deployed to Heroku. Now, before we can test this out, what we also want to do is we didn't deploy our env variable here for our API key, so currently our application isn't going to work. So what we want to do is apply this API key here to our Heroku project, and I'll show you how we can do that. So first off, let's just copy this key, and then we'll head over to our Heroku project here. So what we want to do is go to settings, and then we want to go to this reveal config vars right here, and we want to add our API key. So we'll say API underscore key here, and then we'll paste in the value. And now we have added our API key here to our Heroku project. Okay, so here is our deployed application. So as you can see, we have this custom URL here, and if we try to test out our application, everything should still work. So let's look up a Starbucks here, and we can see we get our results returned here, and we can select one, it still plots it, it zooms in, and we also have our display here, and we can also still remove it. So there we go, we now have our fully functioning app here deployed to Heroku. Okay, so currently the access token that we're using for our map is being exposed on the front end, meaning anybody could get a hold of that token and have the ability to use it. So one cool thing that mapbox allows you to do is you can restrict where you want this token to be used at. So for our access token that we're using for our map, let's do some restricting to only be able to use this token within our own application. So first off, we want to go to edit here. And then what we want to do is we want to go over to our Heroku app here, and we want to copy this URL. Okay, and then all we want to do is add it here, and then we'll click add, and then we want to save the changes. Okay, so we'll confirm our password here and we'll hit submit. So now if we go over to our application, everything should still work fine. So if we refresh here, you can see it's all working. But now if we go over to our local host, you can see that it's going to be all blank here. And if we do refreshing, nothing happens. So if we go to inspect here, what you'll see is that we're going to get console errors with a 403 error of forbidden because we have only allowed that access token to be used here on this URL. Alright everyone, that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you guys did enjoy, be sure to leave a like on it down below and subscribe if you guys are new for more content like this, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.